So I'm ready to start sewing my first round of seam samples. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to do the straight seam, French seam, corner seam, and understitch, maybe not in that order. So for my first seam sample, I have two pieces of muslin prepared right here. I have my lengthwise pieces together. I'm going to be sewing along the length of the pieces, so not across the width. My first seam sample is going to be the straight seam. So what we're going to focus on is stitching my cat is talking. Sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So really lining it up as perfectly as we can with the raw edges of the material together at the 1/2 inch mark on your machine. So we're going to stitch and backstitch at the beginning and end of each seam. And then from there, I'm not going to demo pressing the seams. However, I want everybody to focus on pressing them really well. I will talk about it after we stitch it, but none of these can be sewn or shown really perfectly without pressing them. So be sure to incorporate that as part of your sewing practice, and definitely before you store these away for documentation for later use. Okay, so I'm going to turn on my machine. And again, I'm lining up the edge of my seam sample with the 1/2 inch line on my machine. I'm raising my presser foot and sliding the piece of material underneath the presser foot so that when the needle is inserted, it'll insert into the fabric. I'm going to stitch about 3 stitches and then I will hit the back stitch. So 1, 2, 3, and now I'll back stitch to the beginning. And now I'm going to sew continuously down this seam allowance at a 1/2 inch. So when we talk about seam allowance, it can be a 1/2 inch, a 1/4 inch, an 1/8 inch even, but we really always want to make sure our material stays level with the seam allowance marker to make sure that we're sewing perfectly. Again, I am sewing with my left hand to the side of the material. My right hand is in front, but not anywhere close to the needle. And I'm just progressing pretty slowly. I'm going to backstitch at the end. Crank the wheel towards myself to pull my material away. And I'm going to snip at the base of my cloth to eliminate those threads. All right, so I have sewn my first straight seam. What I want to do before I put it in my sketchbook or my binder, I want to open it up and I want to press it open. When you go to the iron, when you start to iron your fabric, you want to iron directly on the stitch line. So I'm sewing with a dark thread so that you can see what I'm doing, but I actually want to be able to see those stitches when I open up my seam sample. I also want to be able to see them from this side. So I'm finger pressing right now, but you definitely do want to use heat and steam. I don't want any piece of my fabric to really like hang over that seam or the other side. I don't want a lip of fabric. I want it to be perfectly crisp. So if you see those dots in between, you've done a good job ironing. That's what our straight seam should look like. And you can label it straight seam or straight stitch, and it's ready to go in your sewing sample just like that. Okay. Next up, we will do our corner. And so the corner is going to use last week's pivot maze technique. And so I'm going to begin by sewing a straight seam starting from the lengthwise side. I'm sewing at a 1/2 inch again, so keeping my edge in line with the 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'm sewing down this point to a 1/2 inch away from my corner. This is where I'll make sure my needle is inserted into the fabric, and I will pivot and continue sewing to the end and backstitch here. So I'm backstitching at the beginning and end of my piece. I'm going to go ahead and demo this. So stitching, backstitching, And now proceeding forward with my seam. I'm getting close to that 1/2 inch mark, so I'm gonna go ahead and walk my machine the last few stitches. So now that my needle is inserted into the fabric, I look like I'm a 1/2 inch away from the edge. I'm going to raise my presser foot and rotate 90 degrees. So now that my seam allowance, my edge it's almost there, I can do a 1/2 stitch back. So remember, if you're a little off, you can walk it with the reverse as well. Okay, I think that was it. Yeah, that's better. Now I'm right at my half stitch line. So I walked it back a stitch, pivoted, and now I'm ready to continue sewing. I did not backstitch. Okay, I'm backstitching at the end there. I can pull my material away. Okay. And here I have my nice sharp corner. That looks great. So 2 things you can do when turning a corner seam. One, you can clip the fabric on the diagonal about 1/8 of an inch away from that corner so it looks like this. And that'll take away all of this bulk when we turn the corner right side out. Another tip or technique is actually folding the seam allowance, so this material here, on the right angle around that corner to create a crisp edge. So I'm folding it down first. It doesn't matter which side you do first. And then I'm folding over. And so we can see that I have this really clean squared edge. And I'm tucking all the seam allowance. It's flat, right? So I'm holding on to it with my fingers as I go inside this corner. I'm grasping the seam allowance on the outer and the inner. I'm not letting go or shifting at all. And now with my hands on the corner seam allowance, I'm going to go ahead and push it through all the way. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Actually looks pretty good. And so now my piece is ready to press. So it shouldn't feel balled up in there, it should be pretty straight. So I'll do it again. So fold on that seam allowance, on the seam allowance the other direction. Pushing it through just like so. I can see those stitches. So when I iron, I want to make sure that I am pushing the nose of my iron at that stitch line so that I am creating a clean, crisp edge directly on top of those stitches and turning my corner completely right side out, just like so. So this is ready to be pressed and clean, and you can label this your corner sample, and it should look just like that. My corner is totally flat, so there's no bulk in there, and it looks great. Okay, so that's the corner sample. Okay, so I'm going to put it with my straight seam. My next stitch technique is one of my favorite garment finishes, and it is the understitch. So I'm going to take my 2 pieces of fabric and I am going to stitch them at 1/2 inch, just do a regular straight seam like we've already done. So inserting my fabric underneath the presser foot, stitching and back stitching, and then stitching all the way to the edge. This is where my cooking channel technique comes through. So this is a regular straight seam, open it, you want to press everything to one side. It doesn't matter which side, but you, in theory, want to, if we were, this was our garment and this was our facing, which goes towards the body. A facing always faces towards the body. So if this is my garment, this would face towards the skin of our neckline or our hem if it's hanging this way. So we always want to press the seam allowance towards that facing. You can even write facing and press your seam allowance towards that direction, okay? I have one that's already prepped here, okay? So I already did my straight seam and I pressed it before. That's my magic cooking show trick. What I want to do is I want to do an understitch. So it's going to look like a top stitch actually. And I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from that seam, keeping it absolutely parallel. And I'm capturing the facing side as well as all of the seam allowance. So the 2 layers of seam allowance together, pressed towards it, and that facing. What the understitch does is it promotes the outer layer to pop up. So it's adding a little bit of stitch and tension. So this will pop up. So if this is the outer garment or our shell that faces the exterior and this is towards the body, it'll pop up so that we don't see our lining pulling through. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch and backstitch at the beginning. Depending on everybody's machine, the prong of your presser foot will look different and it'll be a little difficult to gauge where exactly to stitch this understitch line. For me, I can line it up with the inner, I can line up my seam with the inner right prong, okay? And that'll keep me a level 1/8 of an inch. If I wanted to line it up with like the middle of that prong, it would be at about 1/4 of an inch. So pick something that you're comfortable with. I like a tidier understitch, so I'm gonna stick with that 1/8. And now I'm gonna stitch all the way to the end. Again, I'm catching the facing side as well as the seam allowance. And it's okay to go slowly here because we are really trying to stay consistent with that stitch line. It can be decorative, so think of it that way. When I pull my piece of fabric away, it will look like this. So I'll have my original seam, and then I'll have my understitch stitching 1/8 of an inch away from that. On the back, I'll actually have 2 stitch lines. So I'll have that original seam, and then the understitching, which is capturing the seam allowance, pushing it, completely trapping it to the facing, okay? So again, theoretically, when we have this in a garment, if this is my outer shell, this is facing the exterior and this is the inner, you can see that it already is popping this side up and pulling this side down. So it pulls our lining or our facing towards the body so that it doesn't pop up. So it looks just like that. It's a really effective, clean, beautiful finish. Okay, so I'm gonna set that aside. That's stitch technique number 3. And then our last and definitely most difficult stitch technique is the French seam. So I just grabbed a pencil. It might help to envision our fabric as having a print right now. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a floral print. Normally when we are sewing 2 pieces of fabric, we are putting the right sides together and our wrong sides are out. And when we open, our seam is on the inside and our beautiful print is on the outside. A French seam works backwards. So we are actually going to put our wrong sides together first. Okay, so our wrong sides are together, so our printed fabric, our good sides are facing out. All of our seam allowance for these 4 seam samples has been at 1/2 an inch. I'm going to sew this though. Our total seam allowance is still 1/2 inch. I'm going to sew it for our French seam at 1/4 inch first. So I'm going to divide it in half. So keep in mind, whatever your total seam allowance is, you want to divide that by half for the first step. So I'm going to line it up with that 1/4 inch. And I'm going to stitch and back stitch as normal. You have to go away. Okay, stitching, back stitching, the usual. Okay. So now that I've done that, when I open it up, it's going to look completely wrong, okay? But that's just getting us ready for our next step. So our seam allowance is on the outside, so is our print. Again, with my cooking channel trick, I have another piece already prepped here. So this has already been ironed. I'm gonna go ahead and draw my print on here as well. Beautiful floral. Okay, so I already took the liberty of ironing this. First, I ironed it. It does not matter for the French seam which side you press your seam allowance to. It can go towards either side, does not matter. And then once I ironed it to, say, this side, I ironed it on the fold, okay? So taking that corner technique of really ironing on that stitch line so we can see all those tiny stitches again. What this does is I'm essentially going to create a pocket that traps my seam allowance on the inside by stitching here on my wrong side. And so I'm creating a pocket so that I won't see my seam allowance anymore. It'll be encased here. It will not allow this seam to fall apart, and my beautiful print will be exposed, okay? So what I'm going to do prior to that, again, my seam allowance was 1/2 inch, and then I pressed it flat and then in half. I'm going to go ahead and trim this down to 1/8 inch. So I'm going to trim it in half from that 1/4 inch. Okay. All right. So my seam should now look like this, okay? I'm going to take off a little bit more. Okay, that looks great. So trimming it down to 1/8 inch from 1/4. All right, so now I'm going to go back to the way I have it pressed. I have it pressed so that my wrong sides are out, my right sides are together, and I'm going to stitch and back stitch at the beginning and end of the stitch line. I'm sewing it at 1/4 inch. All right, my beautiful French seam. So I have my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So the 1/4 and 1/4 added up to 1/2 total. So it's really important. Know your total seam allowance and then divide it in half. When I open my fabric, I have a beautiful French seam. So my right sides of my fabric are out. The wrong sides in the seam are on the same side. Again, this is a perfectly enclosed seam now. It's not like our straight seam where we still have raw edges, right? It's not a finished garment yet. We still need to do something with this seam allowance, whether it's serge or turn and stitch or using pinking shears. This is a completely finished edge, so that I can begin constructing a garment and it will never fall apart. We saw the process of stitching, ironing, trimming, stitching again, and I'll have to iron it again, which is why garments, we don't really see a lot of contemporary garments manufactured with French seams. It is like a fairly vintage technique at this point because it costs so much money in production to handle. But it is a really, really beautiful seam finish. It looks great with sheer fabrics and is a beautiful construction technique. So those are our 4 seam samples. We did the straight, the corner, understitch, and French today. Okay, good luck sewing.